Okay, let's go. Thanks for coming and bearing with this setup. I'm Randy Jones of Madrona Labs, which is down in Seattle. And I'm going to talk today about a project that's a new instrument that I've made that's started from a thesis project at UVic, which I completed in 2008, and now is rapidly on its way to being a finished product that people can buy from me. So it's an instrument called the Soundplane. It's a pressure-sensitive, multi-touch capable surface designed specifically for playing computer music. And so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So the work behind the Soundplane really came out of a context, zooming up to the largest possible context. The problem I was trying to address is that computer music has been really, really great at generating new timbres, some of which we've just heard a few minutes ago, but comparatively its successes at making real-time means of controlling this stuff they're not really up to snuff with the amazing sounds we can make. So, and that's partly been due to necessity. I mean, the tools haven't been there until recently, and so I think that with the computer power that's now available, it's going to be more possible to hold up the hardware end of the equation and allow new kinds of real-time performance that have the flexibility and musicality of an acoustic performance. So the thesis work was kind of based on taking apart a hand drum, this is the master's thesis here, which only a tiny part is visible, but I'll be showing a few pictures from it. And the thesis is titled Intimate Control for Physical Modeling Synthesis. So physical modeling, you've probably all heard of, and it's one of the great resources for sound making that I was talking about earlier. But methods of control over the physical models are lacking somewhat in comparison to the kinds of sounds that can be made. So my thesis was about the idea of taking apart a drum, essentially, to focus this idea of how to make controllers. If you take an acoustic instrument, like the hand drum, it's got two kinds of properties. It's a sound-making artifact, which is to say it can vibrate in certain ways, and it's also a sound-controlling artifact. Now, normally in a physical object, these two properties are linked really intimately by the construction of the object. You have to, if you want to make the drum bigger, you're going to have a lower drum, lower sounding drum, and so on. But with computers, obviously, you can make artifacts that decouple these properties. If you have a good enough physical interface so that you can get the performance data into the computer, you can imagine decoupling the object's properties as sound-making object from its properties as control, and twisting that connection however you want. So the specific physical model I used was a 2D waveguide mesh, which is a very simple mathematical implementation of what's going on in a vibrating membrane. And just as an example of how control and the physical motions of a player aren't normally present in evaluating these models. A lot of the papers, if you read the research on here's the 2D waveguide mesh, we're trying to make drum sounds with it, etc., they were the recorded examples that you hear along with the papers are often made from something like an idealized pulse going into the model. So they'll take this at great pains model a physical object, but then excite it with something that is a mathematical abstraction far removed from playing. So my thesis was essentially around the idea of making the physical part in order to better judge the quality of these models, and in order to make more interesting music with them eventually. So sort of following up from the thesis work and continuing into what I've done since then to make a product then, the goals behind the Soundplane here were that it be precise, able to capture a performer's gestures accurately, where that it be durable, because that's something you need if you're going to have a long-term engagement with an instrument, where that it be affordable, because I want to see a community of people using these things in as much as possible, and composers making pieces for them, and instrumentalists learning to play those pieces. So really, you can only make something so affordable if it's new. And to cut to the chase, I'm selling this for approximately $1,700 soon. So that's how affordable I was able to make it, given the small quantities in which I'm making them at the current time. I also had a goal of ease of use, which is kind of an interesting one in that, if you're giving a talk about instruments to musicians, they often say, well, why should it be easy to use? I've spent my life learning to play the violin. But I think computer music, I'm definitely far from the first person to suggest this, along with kind of the sound resources aspect. Another goal that's been present in computer music research for a long time has been the idea of instruments that have the same open ceiling for virtuosity as acoustic ones, but are in fact easier to approach. So the idea being that when you pick up a violin, it's going to take a while before you make a sound that somebody else might want to listen to. But when you pick this up, and especially depending on the modes of the software that's attached to it, that I'll talk more about later, you can start in making sounds that are quite enjoyable to other people, if that's a concern that you have when you're picking it up. You can also put in a mode where it's very difficult to play right away, and each touch on it is not quantized to any sort of scale, let's say, and it's just as hard to play as a violin. So maybe you start out in an easy mode and end up in a harder one later. With that description, I imagine that there's probably some interest in seeing what this thing can do, and later we can all touch it, but first I want to show a movie that I put together. And no, the movie is a bunch of clips that were gathered at the Decibel Festival, an electronic music festival in Seattle that was just last month. And what I found, so I put together 4 minutes of clips of people for the very first time approaching the Soundplane. They probably weren't expecting to see it and walked through this demo booth on their way to pick up their pass for the festival or whatever. And I thought the variety of approaches to the instrument from musicians, people who self-proclaimed musicians, and non-musicians alike were very interesting. So this is 4 minutes of those varying approaches.
Sounds like a 70s sci-fi hoodie.
Do you want to make Wookiee noises with a new controller? Wow. Super
That's pretty.
Let's play a game. You chase me. How about that?
So that's that. I just showed a short demo movie of my new instrument, the Soundplane, that I'm talking about. And you can see the same thing if you go to my website at madronalabs.com, and you can pick up a card for me later or something if you're interested. So where did this come out of, and why did I make this particular instrument as opposed to any other one? I'm going to talk about a little bit of related work that led to the making of this thing, and speed through it a little bit. The first instrument that really inspired me to make the Soundplane was this thing called the Tactex MTC Express that was made by a company in Victoria in about 2001. And they had this great idea for a pressure-sensitive sensor, surface sensor, and were trying to market it to a musical as a solution for playing computer music. And the result is this red aluminum thing with the small playing surface that you see there. Since then, they've gone on to use the same material to do things like medical sensors and the thing under the passenger seat that tells you if it's okay to fire off the airbag or not. So they had more success with these other markets. The device was a little limiting just in its size and in the sampling rate, which was about 100 hertz, which most people think is too slow to do, nuanced musical performance on. It definitely will throw your rhythm off if you're playing a rhythm, for example, at that sampling rate. But nevertheless, I found this mode of controlling different objects with different distinct touches on each finger very compelling, and so it led me on a search to try and make something like it, only better. There's another commercial product that's available now that's called the Continuum Fingerboard, and a guy, Leopold Haken in Indiana, makes this. For an idea of scale, this thing is about the size of a grand piano keyboard and about 6 inches tall. What it is a sheet of foam on the playing surface that you touch. So it's kind of like playing a wetsuit or something. It's that same kind of foam. And then under it are a bunch of rods that look like this. And when you press on the foam, the rods go down, and sensors can tell where the rod is depressed at each end. So it can tell where you're playing on it in the X dimension, and then as you move that touch up and down in Y, it can also detect that information and pressure. But with the mechanical sensing, there's the limitation that you can only have one touch at any given X location. So the third thing, which is has been quite a successful instrument in the hands of its creator, David Wessel at SynMat in Berkeley, has been David's multi-touch controller, which he's also calling the slabs lately. So if you see reference to the slabs, this is a new version of this same thing. And what this is what it looks like. It's a bunch of mouse pads, the same thing that goes into a laptop, taken out and stitched together essentially. But what makes it more special than that might otherwise suggest is that the people at Berkeley made a really fast digital interface that takes it takes one touch from each pad, X, Y, and pressure, but it takes these at about 6,000 samples per second and transmits all of that information as signal data into the computer. So there's a Maximus P object where you can pull up the results of all of this very intimate control data and do things like make expressive synthesis with it, which is exactly what David does. And he's had the thing in his hands for a while and has done some really quite good performances with it, in my opinion. And it's only a shame that there's not more of them out there. So that's part of what I'm trying to address. I'll gloss a little over the technical details because I definitely want to leave time for questions, and if you're interested in how this thing is actually put together, you can ask. It's a kind of capacitive sensor. Really, in brief, it's related to this. This is what came out of the Thesis work, which was a prototype. So this is a kind of handmade thing in a frame with these copper strips, and you see a couple connectors at left. What was added to this to make it a system that I could play as a musical instrument was an audio interface and a computer. So the thing I just showed is a passive device and requiring both an audio interface and a computer to make it into a pressure sensor. The computer would send out carrier signals on the top layer of copper strips that you saw there in the picture. Beneath those strips there's a layer of foam and then more copper strips underneath, crossing them perpendicularly. So by reading back those received signals from the other layer of strips via the audio interface and analyzing the data on the computer, you can detect the distances between the strips at each of the junctions between them and thereby figure out eventually the force that's applied to the surface. So that was the prototype, and what we have about 2 years later is an 8 by 64 surface, which samples this wooden playing area at 1,000 hertz, 1,000 samples per second. So all along here I've been running this app, and if you hit calibrate, this is an alpha version of the software essentially, so I'm still in development of the software part. What you can see kind of burbling along is the raw data that comes from the pad or from the playing surface. And if you put a touch on it, you can see the varying pressure, and it can detect as many touches as you have fingers, and all of these touches, as you can see, can move independently. So there are varying software layers. The first one is this app which you see, which communicates right to the device and then makes OSC and MIDI information if you want it. And part of the main work that has to be done in this app still is all the user interface stuff that would let people specify what messages exactly they want to be sent when touches happen on the surface, or how these correspond to MIDI notes, or map to different MIDI channels and things like that. And there's just a ton of possible decisions about how to do that, and trying to decide what will be the right features that a lot of people will want, and getting feedback, and then I'll put all these things on a whiteboard and try and design some app that does 90% of it or something. While I'm describing the Soundplane itself, I want to talk about the continuous sensing versus these keys that I wound up with, because it's an important point. So you see the raw data from the sensor here on the Soundplane itself, and on the surface of it, you can see that I've put a guitar-like set of markings on it, and I've put over it not as many keys as there are sensing junctions. In fact, there are two vertical strips under each of these sort of discrete wood keys that you see here. And why I did that and put a sort of, I regard the guitar thing as sort of a playing suggestion, and we may or may not come out with a version when this is released that has no, say, a finer grid and no such keys on it. But I've been talking to other instrument designers, and it gets back to this idea of wanting to develop a community of composers and players. And a lot of people really don't want a kind of blank slate for an instrument. They, everybody addresses with their work some different part of the musical question, be it designing instruments or making compositions or playing something. And a lot of people just want to play something. So if there's a commonality to the way in which people approach the instrument, I think that's good, and that's why I put this sort of playing suggestion out there and refined it a little bit. But it's also, so you see a suggestion of how to use this thing in a discrete way to play, what will probably be chromatic scales. But on the other hand, there's continuous data you can get at underneath if you want to use it as more of a general purpose sensor. So zooming up from that audio, from that control layer to an audio layer, there are different ways you can go after this level of software. You can go up to, you can transmit that OSC data to max MSP, and I'll show a max patch that uses the data right now. Great question, thanks for that. So now I'm printing out the data received from the first touch, which is kind of bouncing all over the place. And remember that the calibration software is yet to be completed, but in Max here you can hear that what it's providing is four independent touches and pressure control over each of them. I have a symbol mapping where X goes to pitch, again in a fretless way, and you can hear that there is very fine control over position possible. Let me just try and... So I'm playing an octave there and just doing a very fine microtonal pitch bend, and it tracks the accuracy of one touch on the surface with much, much higher resolution than the actual spacings would suggest by interpolating between them and figuring out where it is on the surface that you're pressing. And what else I was doing there was just sending Y to a filter cutoff, so you can do some things that would be not intuitive to do on a typical keyboard, certainly, by bending, all kinds of technique, I hope. So that's a pretty fun one. And aside from Max, I've got, as an alternative software layer for people who aren't Max MSP savvy or just want to use this synthesizer, called Aalto, in a version that I'm making for Soundplane. So with this synthesizer, you don't need to make the max patches, and you can very quickly make some. This is that thing that the woman in the demo was using when she's like, it's like a 70s started making these crazy noises. And of course, there's also more. The synthesizer software is designed to be. Designed to have stuck notes, apparently. Designed to be fairly flexible, so you can do sort of acoustic. That's kind of waveguide flute thing that I have going on. So between those layers of software, from the calibration up to the high-level sound-making tools, and beyond with things that people will do, I'm sure, in Max MSP, where they're not just controlling individual notes, but things like stochastic distributions of notes and so on. I hope it's going to be a really good tool for a wide variety of computer musicians. When I came out of my thesis work, I was all excited about the project and had a spreadsheet that in front of me that said, all right, I'm going for the idea, we're in economic downturn, so it's a good time to do it, you know. Just 6 or 8 months and I'll be ready to release my new awesome product. And like 2 years later now, here I am finally with what is a lot like production hardware and ramping up to have these available in just a couple of months now. So I hope I've addressed this goal of making a more sensitive instrument with which people can explore how to make computer music more intimately with their sounds. With that, I'll thank you for your attention and open it up to questions.
So what comes out? This. I'm assuming what comes out of this is control functions. So the end user can map as many of these these values to whatever they want.
So what comes out is what comes out of the. I'll describe what comes out of each layer quickly. So out of this hardware device comes a raw matrix of pressure values over USB. That's just in a very low level format.
At 1,000 hertz.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a lot of data.
It's a lot of data, and it's probably not what you want to use directly.
And what's the resolution?
So it's 64 by 8. So what it's doing is basically saturating one USB 1.0 amount of bandwidth, if you know what that is.
Easily, yeah.
Well, exactly. It's designed to do that. But nevertheless, everyone's got about 8 times that much USB bandwidth on their computers as of late. So that seemed like a good place to, for various reasons, it was easy to write it that way if we cut the data just to that amount. The pressure data is sampled at 12 bits, so you get a 12-bit number for each of the pressure values. Then this app will evolve into the finished thing that puts out OSC, that you can define the mappings for and puts out MIDI data. And there will be things like, you know, the curves to pressure sensitivity that you find in controller keyboards and such. They'll come out of there. So the taxal detection, the touch detection software is something that I'm actively developing and figuring out how to do better. And
so conceivably, if you put your finger down, the area that's controlled could be smaller or narrower or wider.
It could be a parameter of a touch that you might want to use. And this software is going to be open source, so that people can read data from the device directly if they want to and write their own.
Does it have to be a finger?
Touch strings. No, there was the rubber ball thing. It's not using the capacitance to your body at all, just between the plates. So you can, we played it with yarn mallets a bunch, and that seems to work pretty well.
So any physical object that puts pressure.
Yep.
Over. Oh,
exactly.
that's fantastic. That's great.
So would a small rodent be heavy enough to trigger?
Yeah. So, you know, I like to take questions before people try it, because obviously it gets a little crazy when that happens, but
thinking a piece for small.
Yeah, you know,
thinking of your cat or getting your cat a present here.
Exactly.
My cat loves to play my piano, so this would be a whole step up.
Yeah, but my cat can't climb anymore. It's 18 years old, so it really
it
needs something low. Exactly. The scratch pad, the Madrona Lab, the Soundplane next to it, perfect.
Yeah, we could talk about a custom version that would have shag carpet.
So you can shop
it's waterproof.
Yeah.
That's the important part.
Yeah, I guess so. So, any more questions about the setup in general or anything?
So all it needs is the USB and the software, the application running on the Macintosh. So there's no other hardware other than this.
That's right.
And it powers from the USB.
Yeah, it's been USB bus powered, and in fact, I didn't really mean to do the magic trick thing on purpose, but it's been my computer and the Soundplane have been running during this whole talk on just the laptop's battery, and I've still got 31 minutes remaining. So usually you know, it's very, for the amount of processing that it does, it's a very power conserving little guy. Basically what I did was took the audio interface and, you know, figured out how to put it in here instead. So we had to design an audio interface that crunches the numbers and then communicates them over USB. That was the main problem. Any other? Well, probably a gesture is worth 1,000 words. Then if you want to just try it, I can turn it around to be more welcoming, and please come on up if you'd like, or let me know if you want a different sound. So, nobody wants to play this thing? Come on.